All right, it's 11 o'clock a.m. It's Tuesday, April 9th, and at this time, each Tuesday morning, God willing, we're going to study Latin grammar. I've already posted a number of videos for the opening lessons in Latin grammar, the first 7 lessons or so. So I'm going to pick up um, on the lesson on parts of speech. This is Article 16 in our Latin grammar course. So we're going to pick up on Article 16. And just to give some introduction as we get started here, the art of grammar is made up of 4 parts. There are 4 parts of grammar. The first part is orthography. And in the first few lessons that we've already covered, where we talk about letters and syllables and things like that. That's orthography. That's the first part of Latin grammar, and we're pretty much finished with that by now as we get into this second part. The second part, which focuses on the parts of speech, is called etymology, E-T-Y, etymology. That's the second part of grammar. The third part is syntax, which is where we learn the rules of sentence making. And then lastly, prosody, where we learn the rules of poetry and pronunciation and things like that in a more perfect way. So orthography is like basic introduction to pronunciation and letters and word making. Etymology is also the formation of words, understanding the characteristics of the parts of speech. Syntax is sentence building. And then prosody is pronunciation with respect to things like accent, where we get into poetry with rhythm and meter and different concerns like that. So the 4 parts of grammar. And in Article 16, we're getting started with the second part of grammar. Now, Article 16, the topic is the parts of speech. And I just want to say that yesterday at 11 o'clock, I published a video lesson on lesson 2 in classical grammar. And in that video, I gave a pretty detailed introduction to the parts of speech because we talk about them there in classical grammar. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the parts of speech today. I'm not going to give a big introduction or anything like that because I already did that in classical grammar. I think it's lesson 2. I did that yesterday. Um, so I recommend that you use that lesson if you'd like an introduction to the parts of speech. Today, I'm really going to jump into the parts of speech here and get to the important part, which is the declension of substantive nouns. All right. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'd like your attention on the screen here, which is why I'm not turning cameras on. I also recommend that when you come to these live meetings, you bring some paper and a pencil and take some notes. The real benefit of lectures, the benefit of live lessons is that it provides a good introduction to the text. Ultimately, you're going to have to study the text for mastery. There's no way around the study of the text. All of the details of the lessons are included in the text. The live lessons, the video lessons don't necessarily cover anything. I usually try to focus on things that are more important and difficult in the lectures. Make sure that you hear things pronounced, have some confusing parts of the lesson explained and things like that. I'm not going to cover all of the details because you need to study. So the purpose of a lecture now, while you're younger and still studying at home, and later, if you go off to college and attend college lectures and things like that, the lecture is sort of an introduction to the topic. And then usually you're assigned readings and assignments to work on. And it's in those readings and assignments where you really work to master the content. But the lecture is just given as a help from an experienced teacher that makes the study of the book easier for you. That's really what lectures are for. So I recommend that when you come to a class lesson or when you watch a recorded video, you have a notebook or some paper and a pencil, and you just jot down notes. It's not expected that class notes are very neat or organized. You just jot down main ideas, write notes to yourself, things to focus on. to help you with your studies. If there's any advice that I give you about studying, you jot those things down. And then when you sit down to study the lesson for mastery, you have that lecture and those notes as something of a guide and to help you get through those lessons as well as possible. So that's the purpose of lectures and class lessons. And really, the name lesson, it really comes from lectio, and it really means a reading. So a true lecture given by a teacher where there's a real curriculum is not just the teacher talking about whatever they want to talk about, but it's the teacher guiding you through the reading, because the book is really the focal point of our studies. We're studying a great textbook. You know, it's one of the jobs of a good teacher is to search out and find the best textbooks, the best sources for students to study, and then to help the students to study those books. So that's what we're going to be doing in these lectures, okay? The word lecture really just means reading, as I said. Okay, so today we're starting with Article 16, the parts of speech. We're going to quickly go through Article 16 because I already talked about it in a previous video, and those videos are posted on the Latin Grammar course page. So you can check those out on your own. We've gone through the first handful of lessons, and we're picking up now with the beginning of etymology, the second part of grammar, the study of the parts of speech. So again, have a piece of paper out, a pencil, jot things down as best you can. It also helps you to concentrate when you take notes and focus. If anything is unclear or confusing as we go along, jot it down on your notes. Any questions you have, just put a question mark next to a topic or something like that. And then you'll be able to take some time to write up a question and submit it on the forum or submit it to me by email. And make sure if there's something in a lesson that you don't understand, that you ask questions. That's your responsibility as a student. The word student means one who is seeking. And so asking questions, getting things cleared up if there's anything that you don't understand, that's part of the studying process. And you need to take responsibility because your questions are unique. You're going to have questions that are different from another student's questions. You may have things you just can't understand that other students may not struggle with. It's always an individual thing. And so you need to make sure you ask questions to get help and clarify things as you study. Okay, that's your responsibility as a student. My job as a teacher is to try to prevent as much confusion as possible, to try to help as many students with as many issues as I can, and then leave individual support and tutoring for any leftover stuff that individual students need help with. Okay, so we're going to get into the parts of speech here. Article 16. This textbook, this Latin grammar textbook, doesn't take much time to explain the parts of speech or introduce the parts of speech. It just jumps right into them, which is good because, as I said, I've already introduced them in the classical grammar course, which most of you are probably enrolled in. So if you want an introduction to the parts of speech, I recommend you go to the classical grammar course. But here we're just going to jump right in and get to it. So the parts of speech are the noun, pronoun, verb, and particles. And one of the questions on one of the assignments is what are particles? And some students struggle with that, but they're listed right here: adverb, preposition, and conjunction. Okay, so particles are these remaining parts of speech, and we'll see in a minute that they have something in common. But particles are adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions. So we've got nouns, pronouns, verbs, and particles. And don't get the word particles confused with participles, right? Two different words, particles and participles. You'll see that this textbook doesn't actually include participles as one of the parts of speech. And the reason why it does that is because it includes them under adjectives. I mentioned this in that talk yesterday in classical grammar, that if you go from one grammar textbook to another, you'll often see that the number of the parts of speech differs in one textbook from another. And the reason why is because some of these parts of speech, they're related in some ways, and you could lump them together and have two parts of speech really just be one part of speech. So the number of the parts of speech may vary from one book to another, but if you understand what they are, you'll understand what the parts of speech really are and why that numbering isn't very important. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute, okay? But the parts of speech, the main parts of speech are the noun, pronoun, and verb. Those are the main parts of speech. And then the other parts of speech, the particles, and that word particles really means the little parts, right? So you've got the main parts, noun, pronoun, and verb, and then you've got the little parts, or the less important parts, adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions, okay? Now notice where it says the noun, in parentheses, it says substantive and adjective. Substantives and adjectives are two kinds of nouns, but usually in modern grammar books, they're treated as separate parts of speech. And this is what I mean when I say the number of the parts of speech can be thought of in different ways, because we could break it down into detail and say, okay, substantive noun is one part of speech, adjective noun is another part of speech, and so on. We could say participles are a part of speech and separate them from adjectives. In Greek and in English, we say that articles are a separate part of speech, even though they could be included under adjectives. So you just see the number can be varied based upon how we feel like organizing them. We can make the number more or we can make the number less. It really doesn't matter. So don't let that distract you, okay? The main parts of speech, though, the ones we're going to spend almost all of our time on, are nouns, pronouns, and verbs. And we're going to see later on in the next articles why that is. It's because in Latin, nouns, pronouns, and verbs have lots of different forms. So we're going to need to take a lot of time to study nouns, pronouns, and verbs because we're going to have to learn all of their forms. In fact, most of the study of Latin grammar is the study of the forms of nouns, pronouns, and verbs, okay? So that's why we've got these three parts of speech given first, and then the others sort of lumped together under particles. Particles are parts of speech that have no changing forms. It's just one form for each word, and they're basically learned like vocabulary. And you've seen this. If you're in Latin reading, you've already seen this. You've seen adverbs and prepositions and conjunctions. It's really just vocabulary study. For example, the word et is a conjunction. It means and. That's it. That's all there is to know about that word. You just have to learn the word and its meaning, know what part of speech it is, know what its function is, and that's it. There's no other forms or anything like that. The same thing with prepositions like in or sub or trans or super. It's just one word and the meaning of the word. There's no forms or anything like that to learn. So the particles are easy to study, and we study them at the end of the course, at the end of etymology, and really it's just a vocabulary study, all right? So that's why the parts of speech there are divided into two groups. Noun, pronoun, and verb as the major parts of speech, and then adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions. There's another part called interjections. They're all included as particles because they don't have changing forms. They're really very simple to learn, and they're dependent on the main parts of speech. They're optional. We don't necessarily need to use the particles when we communicate, but they make speech flow more smoothly. If you're in English composition, we talk about euphony. They're used for things like that. They're used for rhetorical purposes. They're used to add more detail to make more complex sentences and so on. So those are the parts of speech. And then we get into them individually here. Point one here, we see the substantive gives a name. And this textbook gives you very, very simple descriptions. I wouldn't say they're not definitions. They're descriptions of each of the parts of speech. Very, very simple, which is good. The substantive gives a name, very simply. The word noun just means name. And there are two different kinds of names. We either name something that exists as a thing by itself, that's called a substantive, or we name a quality, and that's called an adjective. So both substantives and adjectives are nouns because they're two different kinds of names. Substantives identify things that can serve as subjects of sentences, right? Things that can exist in our minds by themselves. And the book gives us a couple examples, like vir, a man, kokles, which is an individual name, and donum, which means a gift. But you can see the idea vir, man, can stand by itself in your mind. That's what it means to be a substantive. So the name of a person, place, or thing, that usual definition you get of a noun, that's really referring to a substantive noun. Okay, so that's a substantive. A substantive gives a name. The second point here tells us that the adjective adds quality to a substantive. The adjective adds quality to the substantive. So you see, an adjective can't exist by itself. There has to be a substantive already existing in our mind, and then the adjective is a name of a quality that belongs to that substantive. The adjective adds a quality to the substantive. And the word adjective, that word means set next to, because it's a part of speech that needs to be set next to a substantive. The word substantive means able to stand or exist by itself. So substantive means a name for a thing that exists or stands by itself. Adjective is a name that is set next to a substantive. So if you pay attention to the names, they'll help you remember what the parts of speech are. And we've got a simple example of an adjective, the word bonus, which means good. Okay, bonus vir. You see that Latin word bonus is set next to the Latin word vir. Vir is a substantive. The word bonus is an adjective. It's set next to vir to add quality to the substantive. All right, bonus vir, a good man. That's an adjective. Next, point 3, we've got the pronoun. The pronoun, and this word pronoun simply means in place of. That word pro is actually a preposition itself. Pronoun means in place of a noun. It's a word that stands in place of a noun. The pronoun points something out without describing it. It points something out without describing it. The way that a pronoun is used, for those of you who are just getting started, is in speech, we often give the name of a thing, but we may continue talking about that thing, and we want to refer to it, but we don't want to keep giving the name again and again and again, especially if the name is a more complicated word. We don't want to keep stating the name over and over again when the person we're talking to or writing to already knows what we're talking about. And so the pronoun is used to make it easier and smoother for us to refer back to that thing that we're talking about without stating its name over and over and over again, which is obnoxious. So the pronoun points back to something. It refers to something. It stands in the place of a name that has already been given. So we already know what the subject is. We already know what we're talking about. We've already given its name. We're talking about it again, and we can use the pronoun to stand in place of that name which has already been given. Now, a good note on this, some of you in your assignments, you may get points taken off sometimes, and I'll say something like, don't start a sentence with a pronoun. You'll start a sentence like, they said that blah, 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 or it is believed that, and I'll say, don't start a sentence with a pronoun. The reason why is because a pronoun assumes that you've already given the name and the object or subject is already known. Whereas sometimes when you start answering a question, you may have the noun in your mind, but when you start writing an answer to the question, and I'm the reader, I don't necessarily know what you're talking about. I don't have all the questions memorized, so it's not good practice. It's not good grammar to start a sentence with a pronoun because the reader might not know what you're referring to. And so it doesn't make any sense to begin with a pronoun. You should always begin and identify your subjects and objects clearly with their names, and then later in the sentence, you can use a pronoun. So if you've ever had points taken off for starting sentences with pronouns, or I've made a comment like that, that's why it's not right to start a sentence with a pronoun. okay? A pronoun stands in place of a noun. You should always make sure you give the name and make it clear what you're talking about, and then afterwards you can replace the name with a pronoun, okay? We're given a couple examples of Latin pronouns. The word hic means this, and notice how this points out something without stating its name, right? It points something out without stating its name. Now, the word this assumes that the other person already knows what's being talked about, right? Well, and sometimes we don't necessarily say the name, but we might actually show it to someone. Like I might hold this up and say this is gray. And when you hear this, and I'm showing you what I'm talking about. So there are other ways we communicate also, and a pronoun can be used to point something out without describing it, as the rule says here. The second example is the Latin word ille, which means he or that. So you see, hic means this. We're talking about something close to us, and ille means that, and we're sort of pointing to something in a distance. Two different pronouns. And then they give one more example, ego, which is a personal pronoun that means I. So if I was speaking to you, obviously if I'm speaking to you, I would introduce myself and give you my name, right? When I first begin speaking, like when I start a video, I say, hello, I'm William Michael, blah, 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 blah. I give my name. And then afterwards, I don't refer to myself as William or William Michael anymore. I then, after that, use the pronoun. I'll say I or me or my and so on. I don't keep repeating my name. That'd be obnoxious. I'd sound like a crazy person. All right. So ego is I, and we'll learn the personal pronouns, all the different personal pronouns, all the different demonstrative pronouns like hic and ille, all the different relative pronouns, reflexive pronouns. There's lots of different kinds of pronouns, and you need to learn how to use them all. And you need to learn in Latin, you need to learn all of their forms because pronouns are very important for clear translation. All right. Point 4 is the verb. And in Latin, I know many of you take Latin reading 1. You know that the word verbum, we meet that in John chapter 1, in principio erat verbum, right at the beginning of the gospel. The word verbum just means word. So it's kind of strange that one of the parts of speech is called the word. And then there's a reason for that. The reason is because the verb, notice the description here, it says, the verb expresses a complete thought. So a verb by itself is capable of expressing a complete thought. A complete thought is a sentence. So a verb can actually express an entire sentence by itself. And that's why it's called the word, because it's the essential word of a sentence. You don't have to have a noun to make a sentence. You don't need a pronoun or an adjective or a substantive to make a sentence, but you must have a verb to make a sentence. The verb is the essential word that makes a sentence, and so it's referred to as the word as one of the parts of speech. Okay, the verb expresses a complete thought by itself. It can express a complete thought by itself. Whether an assertion, that's when we say that something is true. We make an assertion. It can be true or false, right? Like, it is raining outside. That's an assertion. It is raining. It's either true or false. That's the first kind of sentence that can be made, the first way that a verb can be used. The second kind is a wish. A wish is not true or false. If I say, I wish it would snow, the wish is not true or false. It's just an expression of a desire. You can't say, false. What are you talking about? I said, I wish it would snow. I didn't say it's snowing outside. I said, I wish it would snow. That can't be true or false. That's the second kind, or a second way a verb can be used to express a wish. The third way is to express a command. If I say, get up, that's not true or false. It's not like an assertion. Get up is a command. It's a different way of expressing an idea. Those are called the moods of verbs, different forms of expression. What's important for our studies, especially when we get into logic and reasoning, is that there's only one kind of verb that's used in reasoning, and it's the assertion. It's called an indicative statement or a declarative sentence in different grammar books. In our reasoning courses, it's referred to as enunciation. It's when we make a statement that can be true or false. That's what we deal with in reasoning. The other kinds of expressions, wishes and commands and things like that, they're considered rhetorical. They're used to try and move people, express different feelings and things like that. But assertions or indicative statements are actually true or false. That's what we think about and talk about in reasoning. So different modes of verbs. And what that means in Latin is that there are going to be different forms for verbs that express those different modes. And we'll see that when we get to the forms of verbs. We'll see how these different ideas and different kinds of expressions are shown in the language by the form that's used. So when someone speaks in Latin, when we're reading something in Latin, we can tell by the form of the verb whether they're making an assertion or whether they're just expressing a desire or a wish, or whether they're giving a command. Okay, so we'll be able to identify that by the form, and then use our knowledge of the forms to accurately translate the meaning of that verb into English. We're given three examples of verbs here, the same verb in three different forms, showing these three different moods. Okay. First, we have this form amat. Amat. And remember, when we have a two-syllable word, the first syllable is always accented. So it's amat. And we see that it means he loves. Notice that there's a pronoun built into the form of the verb. This is why a verb can stand by itself in a sentence, because it's got the person and the action built right into it. So it can express a complete thought by itself. Amat, he loves. We see that's an assertion, right? That's a simple indicative statement, an assertion. He loves. It's true or false. He either loves or he does not love. That's an example of the first mode of verbs, or the first kind of verb. Then we have the same verb, but you'll notice that the vowel at the end changes. Instead of amat, it's amet. See, the vowel changes. That changing of the vowel changes the mood or the mode of the verb. It changes it from an assertion to a wish. So instead of saying he loves, which is an assertion, amet says may he love. It's an expression of a wish. And the speaker changes the form to make it clear that he's not making an assertion. He's expressing a wish or a desire or even a prayer. Okay? So you can see how the form changes, as simple as the changing of a vowel, and it changes the meaning of that verb. And then lastly, you see ama. There's no consonant at the end. It's ama. And this is an example of a command. By changing the form, we now change the mode of the verb so that it expresses a command. Love thou. And that's just a way of saying, hey, love. You need to love. Love. Ama. Okay? So three different modes of verbs, and you can see that they're expressed not by changing the whole sentence, but simply making subtle changes to the words that show the intention of the speaker. And when we translate Latin, we've got to be able to look at those words, understand what all those little changes mean, and then make a good translation into English. Because in English, we don't do this very much. In English, we actually write out all the words, and we express everything in a longer way by adding more words rather than by playing with the forms of the words. So it's important for translation. All right, so that's point 4, the verb. Then from points 5, 6, and 7, we learn about the particles, those last 3 parts of speech which don't have different forms. They're very simple. Adverb, preposition, and conjunction. The adverb shows circumstances. It adds detail to verbs or adjectives. It adds more detail. So for example, Um, that the verb amat that we just learned in point 4 there says he loves. Well, that's kind of boring. It doesn't really give me much information. I want to know, how does he love? How does he love? Tell me more. Tell me more about his love. How does he love? And I could say, he loves ardently. He loves ardently. I can say he loves very much. He loves ardently. That word ardently is an adverb. It adds detail, it adds circumstance to the verb. And it can also be used with adjectives to add further detail to, um, to an adjective. Okay, so the adverb shows circumstances, it adds more detail to verbs and adjectives. The preposition, oh, and I should just say also that the word adverb, the name, means set next to a verb or set next to a word. So it's added to a word to add circumstances or detail to that word. Okay. One of the questions I ask in the assignment is, how do the names of the parts of speech help us to understand their meaning? And this is what I'm talking about. If we learn what the parts of speech are, and we learn the meaning of the names of the parts of speech, we can see that the meaning is actually built into the name. So the meanings, or the names, I should say, the names help us to remember what the different parts of speech are, which is kind of cool. All right, so adverb is a part of speech that's set next to a word. Then we've got the preposition, number 6, and you can see by looking at the name, preposition, if you pronounce it as pre-position, pre means before, position means place. So a preposition is a word that's placed before a noun. So if I say underground, ground is a substantive noun, under is a preposition. It's placed before the noun. Preposition. It shows local relation. It shows a certain type of relation, the preposition. Okay. So if I've got nouns in a sentence, I may have a subject and then I may have an object. Like I could say, he loves his wife. So I've got a subject and I've got an object. I've got the verb loves. But there might be other ideas that I want to express, and so there would be other nouns in the sentence, and that could get confusing. If there were 5 or 6 different nouns, you might wonder, what is he actually talking about? What does he actually love? Who actually loves? And so on. It could be confusing. Prepositions show us the relationships of different nouns to the idea that's being expressed in the sentence. It expresses relations. It helps us to understand the role that each noun plays in the sentence. And the best way to understand this is to see examples as we work through Latin reading together, to look for examples of prepositions, look for examples of adverbs and conjunctions and so on as you go through your Latin reading lessons. And as you study Latin grammar and learn what things are, then go into Latin reading and look for those things, and you'll see hundreds and hundreds of examples of them, and your understanding of the translation will become very clear. That's the benefit of studying grammar and reading together. So a preposition shows relations between nouns in a sentence. And then lastly, point 7, the conjunction, and the word conjunction just means a joining together, a conjunction. The conjunction shows connection. The conjunction shows connection. Now, it's a little confusing to say that a conjunction shows connection, because that idea of connection might make it seem like two things go together, right? And pretty obvious that's what connection means. But there are conjunctions that are negative, that actually say that things don't go together. Like, tomorrow it is going to rain or snow. And those two things are actually separate. And so the idea of connection is not that simple, that it just puts them together like a conjunction always says that both are going to take place or both exist. There are negative conjunctions that actually say one or the other, or this, not this. Okay? But the idea of connection is that it takes two words or two ideas in a sentence, and it shows that in some way they're connected to one another. It can be connected with an expression like and, but it could also be connected with an expression like however, one sentence connecting to another sentence or different phrases. It can be negative like but or however, which sort of says we're going in the opposite direction. It doesn't have to be positive and say that they're both joined and kept together. Okay, so a conjunction just expresses connection between two different parts of speech or two different parts of a larger speech, like sentences themselves or whole paragraphs even. All right, those are conjunctions. So we've gone through the different parts of speech. We can see that they number 7 in this Latin grammar book: substantive, adjective, pronoun, verb, adverb, preposition, and conjunction. And now that you have a basic idea, and when you study this lesson and really master the content of this lesson and begin to understand what the parts of speech are, you've got to make the commitment to your own learning to now go into your Latin reading lessons and look for this stuff. You've got to pay attention to these things in your Latin reading lessons because, as I said, the Latin reading lessons provide you with hundreds and hundreds of examples of all of these things. When you learn a word in Latin reading, you can be lazy and just learn the word, learn its meaning, and go take the quiz and, mindlessly almost put the answer into the box and submit the quiz and get a passing grade. That's not hard. But that's not what you should do if you want to learn the language. You should learn a word when you're studying the translations and doing the translation exercises. You should study the word and you should ask, what part of speech is this word? And then when you see what part of speech it is, you should think back to grammar and ask yourself, well, what does that mean? What does that tell me about this word in the sentence? And then look at the translation and you'll see how the meaning of that word, based on its part of speech, explains the translation. So rather than just memorizing or learning the translation, like a computer, just mindlessly, you can actually begin to understand and see where the translation comes from. And that's what you should be challenging yourself to do. Now, in Latin Reading 1, you really don't have to do that because in Latin Reading 1, we're really just learning vocabulary. It's very easy. You can do the translation exercises with your mind almost turned off on autopilot. You can take the quizzes, and they're just simple vocabulary quizzes. It's very easy. But when we get to Latin Grammar 2, Latin Reading 2, that changes. Because in Latin Reading 2, all of a sudden, you're going to have to understand the grammar. Now, the reason why I don't ask grammar questions in Latin Reading 1 is because I assume that you're studying Latin Grammar 1 at the same time, so you don't know that stuff. So I don't ask you about grammar in Latin Reading 1. I give you time to study Latin Grammar 1 while you're studying Latin Reading 1. But when we get to Latin Reading 2, that changes. Latin Reading 2 assumes that you have studied or are studying Latin Reading 1. And you've got to now start answering questions about the grammar in the sentences. So if you work on that and think about that while you're working through Latin Reading 1, you'll be in good shape when you get to Latin Reading 2. If you just ignore that and just, lazily rush through the lessons, thinking that you're so great because you can blitz through all the lessons, you don't follow the instructions, you don't copy out the Latin translation exercises, you just jump to the quizzes and use the lesson to help you through the quizzes, you might be fooling yourself to think that you're getting through those lessons and marking everything complete. But when you get to Latin Reading 2, you're going to run into a wall and you're not going to be prepared to get over that wall. So I'm just warning you now, when you see lesson instructions in a course, those lesson instructions are being given to you by a teacher who knows what's coming. And I'm telling you how you need to study those lessons, how you need to complete those lessons so that you're prepared for the next level. And if you think you're clever and you dodge those instructions and you do it the easy way and you say, nobody's going to know if I just write this translation exercise out one time and turn it in, nobody's going to know. You're right. Nobody will know. But in Latin Reading 2, we'll know that you didn't study the translation exercises. And then what are you going to do? What are you going to do when you've now spent a whole year working on Latin Reading 1, didn't learn it well, and are unprepared for Latin Reading 2? You're going to be in a real mess. You're either going to have to go back and do Latin Reading 1 all over again the right way, or you're never going to be able to make easy progress through Latin Reading 2, and you're just going to stall and get stuck and move at a turtle's pace. So you're going to get caught eventually because you're simply not going to have the language knowledge that you would have had if you followed the instructions. So be careful that you don't fool yourself and think that you can get around the instructions. The instructions are given for a reason based on what's coming next, okay? But now that you know the parts of speech and you've got some examples to get you started, what I recommend is those brief descriptions of the parts of speech, they're not very accurate. They could be better, but they're helpful because they're brief. It's a good starting point. If I were you, I would jot them down, as shortly as possible. Jot them down on a piece of paper or an index card or something like that, and just keep it with you when you study Latin reading so you can refer to it easily and then think about it as you work through the translation exercises. Ask yourself, what part of speech is this word? How do I know this word is that part of speech? What does it mean that this word is that part of speech? Then look at the translation and ask, how does knowing the part of speech for this word help me to understand the translation? So you'll begin to be able to work through the Latin reading course and the translations with understanding rather than just by memorization like a robot, okay? So if you're studying grammar, use your grammar knowledge, bring it back with you into Latin reading and start to think about it, because there you have all the examples that will help you to understand it clearly. And by doing that, by thinking of grammar when you study Latin reading, your Latin reading will also help you to understand Latin grammar. When you study Latin grammar and learn a new concept, you'll say to yourself, oh, I can think of examples of that because I've seen that in my Latin reading, because I pay attention and I'm thinking about grammar as I study Latin reading. So the two courses will help one another. Latin reading will help grammar, and grammar will help Latin reading, okay? So we've gone through these 7 parts of speech. Then there are some notes which I'm going to skip because I want to get down to Article 17 here. In Article 17, we read about inflection. And what's important to know is that Latin and English are different kinds of languages. Latin and English are different kinds of languages. And this is why it's a little bit difficult for students, English-speaking students, to learn Latin, because it's a different way of communicating. It's a different way of expressing ideas. In English, English is sort of a language for common people. It's not a very intelligent language. And what I mean by that is, if you want to express something that's more complicated in English, you just use more words. You just keep adding words to the sentence to express more and more of the idea as it gets more and more complicated. So in English, we just use lots and lots of words to express things. In Latin, it's inflected. And what that means is that forms of words change. Forms of words change. And those little details in the language actually reveal the ideas of the speaker. So it's much less wordy than English. You can express a complicated idea in Latin in just a few words because a lot of the meaning and the details are built into the forms of the words. That's why if you want to think of a motto for a business or something like that, or a motto for a school, you'll often see that the mottos are in Latin. And there's a reason for that, because you can take a big phrase, and if you use that as your motto and you used it in English, it would look silly because you'd have this big sentence written across the flag or written across your business card or something like that. It would look silly, all these English words. But in Latin, the motto can be expressed usually in just 2 or 3 words. And all of the other information is in the forms of those words. So Latin is very succinct. It's very concise. You can express complicated ideas with very few words. English is the opposite. We just ramble and ramble and ramble. We use lots of words to express our ideas. And that's why I tell you, when you're doing the translation exercises, I tell you to write out the Latin usually. I say write out the Latin in all uppercase letters. Make it real big because Latin takes up less space than English. And when you work on the translation, you may have one Latin word that needs three English words to translate it. And so you've got to give yourself space to be able to write the translation. That's also why I ask you to translate the Latin one word at a time, because it's confusing sometimes to match up the Latin and the English translation, because there may be one Latin word that has two or three English words as its translation. And if you really don't understand the translation, you'll match things up in a sloppy way because you really don't understand that that one Latin word is translated by those three English words. And I want to make sure you understand those details. That's why I ask you to write one Latin word and then write its English translation, then write the next Latin word, then write its translation. Okay, that's the reason why. It's because of inflection. And what inflection means is that the words change form. Okay, very simple. We've already talked about this. You've already seen this. Inflection just means the ideas of a language are communicated by changing the forms of the words. That's inflection. Okay, very simple. And you're told there in the lesson that inflexio in Latin means bending. So we take the basic form of a noun or the basic form of a verb or the basic form of a pronoun, and we kind of bend it, we twist it and change it to make it express a different idea. And we'll see more of what that means when we get into these different forms in coming lessons. So inflection is the bending or changing of the form of a word, chiefly in the end. Usually the changes take place at the end of the word, which shows a change in the relations of that word to the other words or ideas in a sentence. The noun, pronoun, and verb are inflected. Particles are not capable of further inflection. So this is why particles are all lumped together. Particles are lumped together because they're not inflected. They don't change forms. Nouns, pronouns, and verbs are inflected. So in order to understand how to read or how to use Latin nouns, pronouns, and verbs, we have to learn all of their forms. And that's what we studied in grammar. The inflection of nouns and pronouns is called declension. The inflection of nouns and pronouns is called declension. The inflection of verbs is called conjugation. So declension and conjugation are two different kinds of inflection. So you've got inflection, and then that divides into declension and conjugation. Declension refers to the inflection of nouns and pronouns. Conjugation refers to the inflection of verbs. So if I want to ask you to give me the forms of a noun, I'll say conjugate the noun vir. Conjugate the noun homo, conjugate the noun donum, and so on. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. It's early. I would say decline the noun vir, decline the noun homo, decline the noun donum. And I would do the same for pronouns, all right? I would use the verb decline in the instructions. It means give the inflection of this noun or pronoun. And then if I talked about verbs, I would say conjugate the verb amo, like we saw above. Conjugate the verb laudo, and so on. All right, so conjugate simply means to inflect or give the inflection of verbs. Decline means to give the inflection of nouns or pronouns. All right, so there's inflection and then two kinds of inflection, declension and conjugation. Don't let those words confuse you. That's Article 17. Now you can see in Article 18, we actually get into the first of the parts of speech. So we're going to study the declension of substantive nouns. We're going to study all of the forms of substantive nouns. But the first thing that we're going to learn is, or are the properties of substantive nouns. So in Article 18, we're introduced to some of the properties or divisions of substantive nouns, which is helpful. Then we learn about the gender of substantive nouns, which is one of the properties of substantives, gender. We see that's Article 19 and 20 and 21. Then in Article 22, we're going to get into the number of Latin nouns, which is another characteristic of nouns. Then we're going to get into cases in Article 23. And then after we study the cases, 23, 24, 25, in Article 26, we're going to start studying the different declensions of nouns and learn all of their forms and things like that. So we'll walk through all this stuff together. I don't think you need a whole lot of help with these lessons. It's really pretty simple. It just takes some time because there's memory work involved and things like that. But we'll go through each of these articles together in these weekly meetings, and I'll produce videos that I'll attach to the lesson pages, so you always have some extra help when you need it or if you need to be reminded of something. But what I'd like you to do is study as quickly as you can through the course on your own. There's an article, How to Study for Mastery. I recommend you read that and follow the instructions there, but study as fast as you can, and then use these live classes or videos to just help you to make sure you've covered all the points. You can watch them before you study. I don't recommend that usually because it's usually good to go through the lesson yourself first, because when you read through the lesson, you can see that some lessons are easy and you can master them by yourself. You don't even need to look at a video. You could just go on and keep moving, which should be your goal, to progress as quickly as you can. As long as you're doing everything correctly and you're studying carefully, you should try to advance as quickly as you can. But go back and watch a video. Just make sure you've covered everything. Make sure there's, if I make any notes or comments, you understand those things. But I want you to move forward as fast as you can. And I'm just going to come along 1 week at a time and post a new lesson that you can use. It may be helpful, maybe already stuff that you know by your own study. That's good if that happens. It's also a way to test yourself. If you watch one of my videos and you've already studied that lesson and you go through the video and say, yeah, I know all that stuff, that's a sign that you're doing pretty well studying. Just on a side note, when you get to college, it's usually assumed by the professors that students aren't going to study very well on their own. And so the lectures are meant to help make sure the students get through all the content. The problem with lectures is that they're really not necessary if you're a student who studies well. And if you prove to your professor, if you prove that you can study well on your own and get high scores, even perfect scores, without the help of lectures, just by studying, which is the mark that you're a really good student. You don't need someone to tell you what the lessons mean. You can figure it out on your own. Sometimes you can be excused from attending classes in college, and that allows you to study more because you don't have to waste so much time going to class and things like that. So being able to take a text, this is why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I really want you to focus on texts. Being able to take a text, study it for mastery, learn how to master the content of a text, and then demonstrate your mastery. That's really the art of how to study. Okay. When you're 14 years old, 17 years old, whatever, it may be nice to have this little video lesson you can use. And there's all these different programs and things you can watch videos, or they've got some interactive slides that you can use or activities that you can do. That's cute when you're young. But as you get older and get into more complex studies, those resources and all those little, activities and gimmicks and things like that, they're not going to be around anymore. And at some point, you're going to have to get into studies where there's no more, there's no more silly games and quizzes and all this kind of stuff. You have to learn to wean yourself off of all of these things and be able to just attack a text, study it for mastery, learn how to study for mastery, and do that with no help, because ultimately, at some point, if you're serious about any kind of work or study, you're going to have to be able to study on your own. You're going to have to learn to solve problems on your own. You're going to have to learn to study subjects that nobody else is studying. You're studying them by yourself, and you're going to have to learn how to do that. So the videos are helpful, things like that now, but the real test of your study skill is whether you can take a text, like the text we have in our lessons, study it, master all of the content, and prove your mastery of that content. And most importantly, begin to use that content in other studies, in your life, and so on. That's the real test of your studies. So the best student in the world wouldn't be watching videos and all this kind of stuff. The best student would be working to learn how to master studying from a simple text. One of the main reasons is because it's cheap. You can afford it. When you get into higher studies, sometimes you have to study things and there's no money to pay somebody to tutor you in those things. There may be no one even available to tutor you in these subjects. When I took up the study of the classical liberal arts, there was no one to teach me. I've worked to restore the classical liberal arts. I worked to find all these books and organize the whole curriculum. That was work that I had to do. There was no one that I could turn to and say, hey, Professor Jones, can you tell me the answers to all these questions I have? There was no one like that. And if you look through history, you'll see that great people in history, if you think about it, they had to figure out things that no one else had known. Aristotle had to write his works because he was the discoverer of the art of reasoning. Aristotle couldn't turn to a video or some activity to help him. He had to be able to study and figure things out independently. That's the ultimate skill with study, to be able to get everything you need from the simplest possible source, because it makes it sustainable. You can study and pursue different fields of knowledge. You can pursue different languages, different subjects, and so on. And you don't need any money at all, because it's very easy to get texts and books, online copies of books and things like that. There's no limit to what you can study if you learn to study from text. So I want to challenge you. Use these videos while you can, but don't sit around waiting for videos, because that's not how study works. I can tell you right now, you're not going to have a yellow brick road of videos prepared for you that you can just sit there and watch for the rest of your life. If you're going to become an expert in some field, you're going to have to be the one who goes out and leads in that area on your own. And you're going to have to learn how to study from simple sources, okay? So work through these lessons in grammar and reading as quickly as you can. Go back, watch the videos, and you can use them as a sort of a test of how well you're doing with your studies. If there's anything I mentioned that isn't included in the lesson, just because I have years and years of experience, so I can sometimes add some notes or comments that might be helpful. Pay attention to those things, but use the videos to test how well you're doing with your studies. Use them to review and so on. But keep moving forward and don't let anything slow you down. You have the text, you have the assignments, you've got instructions, how to study the texts that give you some direction. Work as hard as you can to make as much progress as you can in as many subjects as you can. That's the sign of a really great student, okay? These videos are just meant to be helpful, so use them as helps, but don't pretend that you're dependent on them, because you're not. So that's all for today. We basically went through Article 16, which introduces the parts of speech. We talked briefly about Article 17. We'll review Article 17 next week when we get into substantives and start studying the declensions and the properties of substantives. But that's going to be all for today. So we went through, like I said, the parts of speech. If you want more detailed information on the parts of speech, go check out the video that I posted yesterday in classical grammar. But other than that, I think this is pretty simple once you get the hang of it. Use your Latin reading for examples, and we'll get working next week on the declensions of Latin nouns and really start to understand what's going on in the language. All right? So that's all for today for this recording. It takes me a few hours in the evening to get these videos put together, and I'm going to be linking them to the course pages. So you're not going to have to go to YouTube or anything like that to find them. The links will be added right to the pages. Yesterday's lessons, the videos are already linked to those pages. So you don't have to look anywhere for the videos. They'll be added to the pages. And if you need any help, just let me know, okay? Post any questions you have on the forums, on the course pages. And if something is personal you want to talk about, send me an email. But that's it for today. So you're free to go. I have a class to start at 12:15 today in scripture, so I've got to get going to get into that class. But like I said, any questions, anything like that, anything in the lesson you don't understand, or even if you're just curious, even if there's something you see that's interesting or you're wondering about something, you'd like to ask a question, feel free to post any questions you have. All right. Post them right in the forums on the course pages, and either I'll respond or someone else, other students can respond as well. Okay. So that's all for today for Latin grammar. I'll see you next week for Latin grammar. If you're going to join me for Latin reading, I'll see you in a couple hours. All right. God bless everybody.